You're fired. Get out of my building. Damian Kingston's voice split the boardroom in half. Adriana Romano set the files down slowly. Before I go, tell them who really closed the Hendricks account. The door opened before Damian could answer. Sit down, Damian, Dante Moretti said, unbuttoning his jacket like a man who already owned the floor beneath their feet. You don't have the shares to fire anyone. Not anymore. What none of them knew yet, not Damian, not the board, not even Dante himself, was that the woman standing in that room had been tied to his family for 22 years, long before either of them was born into the mess that was about to collide. He just hadn't recognized her name yet. And when he finally did, it would nearly cost him the only thing he'd ever wanted for himself instead of for his family. Before we go further, subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. Now let's go back to the beginning, because nothing in this story is as simple as it looks. Adriana Romano had a rule. Never look up when a man in an expensive suit is standing in her way. Looking up gave them power. Looking up made them think they'd been noticed. 7 years at Kingston Global had taught her that the men in this building noticed you exactly as much as they needed something from you, and not a second longer. So when she came around the corner on the 19th floor with the Hendricks contract pressed to her chest and a stranger blocking the boardroom door, she didn't look up. She said, "Move," and let the tone do the work her eyes wouldn't. He moved. Half a step. Enough. What she didn't see, because she never looked up, was the way his eyes followed her the entire length of the hallway, the way something in his chest went suddenly inconveniently quiet. Dante Moretti had spent his whole life being looked at, feared, measured, wanted, in the specific transactional way that came with his last name. He had never once in 32 years been dismissed by a woman who didn't even bother to check if he minded. He minded. He minded more than he wanted to admit, standing there in a hallway that smelled like coffee and printer toner, feeling something shift in his chest that felt embarrassingly close to what poets wrote about and men like him were trained never to believe in. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that 3 floors below, his lawyers were quietly finalizing paperwork that would make him this building's largest shareholder within the hour. He didn't know that her late father's name was buried somewhere in his own family's private ledgers, in a file even his father rarely opened, in a drawer that hadn't been touched in over 2 decades. He only knew that for the first time in years he wanted to follow a woman through a door she hadn't invited him through, and that the wanting itself felt dangerous, the way wanting things always felt dangerous to a man raised to believe that wanting made you weak, and weak men in his family did not survive long. Inside, Damian Kingston sat at the head of the table wearing the specific brittle confidence of a man who had never once built anything himself and had spent his whole life terrified someone would notice the gap between what he owned and what he'd earned. He opened the Hendricks contract. His face changed. "These numbers don't match what I told the board." "They match now," Adriana said. "They didn't an hour ago. You sent the wrong terms to legal at midnight, half a bottle of scotch into your evening. I flagged it in an email at 11. I fixed it at 6. You're welcome, though I notice you haven't said it." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room enjoying someone else's humiliation and pretending very hard not to. Damian heard it. He always did, and he always reached for the same weapon when he heard it, because it was the only weapon he'd ever needed until this morning. "You're fired," he said, standing so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. "Get out of my building." Adriana set the files down slowly, the way you set down something you've decided you no longer need to carry gently. 7 years of unspoken math clicked into a final total in the back of her mind, and the total finally was enough. "Before I go," she said, "tell them who really closed the Hendricks account. Or the woman you're firing at 9 in the morning for catching you in a lie in front of your own board." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. 2 executives were already looking at their phones, not because they had anywhere else to be, but because they'd learned over the years that it was safer not to be caught agreeing with her out loud. The door opened. "Sit down, Damian," Dante said, stepping inside like the floor already belonged to him because in 9 minutes it would. "You don't have the shares to fire anyone. Not anymore." "Who the hell are you?" Damian said, though the fight had already drained out of the question, replaced by something closer to dread. "The man your board spent 6 months courting for a real estate position you apparently forgot about the moment it stopped flattering you," Dante said, unhurried. And a man who just watched you throw away the only person in this building who actually knows how to run it. Adriana turned to him and he expected, foolishly he'd later admit, something like gratitude. What he got instead was fire, aimed squarely at him. I don't need you to fight my battles. I wasn't fighting it, Dante said, something flickering behind his calm that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier, something that looked, if you knew where to look for it, almost like admiration. I was watching a mistake happen in real time and deciding I'd rather not be in the room for the aftermath. She walked out without another word, spine straight, chin level, leaving behind a stunned board, a humiliated billionaire, and a man who stood there a beat too long watching the door swing shut, feeling something he hadn't felt in years and couldn't yet name. The specific unsettling sensation of meeting someone your whole life had somehow been quietly arranging you to meet, without ever telling you the appointment was on the calendar. 3 weeks before that morning, Dante had stood in his father's study while a family council stripped him of everything he'd spent his life earning, on the word of a cousin who wanted it more than he'd ever wanted to deserve it. He forgets what family means, Marco Rinaldi told the council, his voice practiced, wounded, false in a way that only worked on men who wanted to believe it. He spends more time with lawyers in glass towers than he spends at this table. Vincent Moretti hadn't defended his son. That silence was the wound that never quite closed. Not the loss of the seat, but his father watching it happen and choosing, for reasons Dante didn't understand yet, to let it, the way a man lets a hand go cold rather than admit he's the one holding it too tightly. Step back, Vincent said afterward, not meeting his son's eyes. Cool off. Let the council settle. It wasn't a suggestion. Dante left that house with a decision already forming, cold and clear the way his best decisions always were. Disappear long enough to let Marco's arrogance do what Dante's patience couldn't do quickly. Destroy itself slowly, publicly, without Dante having to lift a finger or spill a drop of family blood to make it happen. He turned to a private portfolio the family had never bothered to notice, built for a decade under a name that wasn't Moretti, funded with money nobody at that table had ever thought to ask about. Kingston Global was supposed to be one line on a list. A distraction. A courtesy meeting he'd almost cancelled twice. Then a woman in a blue blazer told him to move and didn't look back, and something in Dante Moretti, something old, something patient, something that had been waiting its whole life without knowing it was waiting, woke up for the first time since he was a boy who still believed his father's silences meant nothing. What Dante didn't know yet, what even his own investigators hadn't uncovered in their first week of digging, sat in a locked drawer in Vincent Moretti's study, in a folder that had not been opened in 22 years, its edges gone soft with the particular dust of a secret nobody had disturbed in a long time. Inside it, a photograph of a man named Marco Romano, not the cousin, a different Marco, Adriana's father, standing beside a much younger Vincent Moretti outside a warehouse that no longer existed, both of them laughing at something the photograph couldn't tell you. A payroll record faded. A coroner's report, dated the same week Adriana turned 9 years old, folded so many times the crease had worn nearly through the paper. Adriana's father had not died in a car accident, the story her mother had told her gently for 22 years, to protect a child from a truth too heavy for small shoulders. He had died taking a bullet meant for Vincent Moretti during a dispute with a rival family, in a warehouse deal that had gone wrong in the space of 11 seconds. 11 seconds Vincent Moretti had relived in some form almost every night since. Vincent had paid for the funeral anonymously. He had for over 2 decades, quietly funneled money toward Adriana's mother's medical bills through a shell foundation that never once used the Moretti name, a debt he never spoke of to anyone, not even his own son, not even the wife he'd buried 9 years into keeping the secret. It was the only piece of guilt Vincent Moretti had ever allowed himself to keep alive on purpose. Neither Adriana nor Dante knew any of it yet. But the ledger had been waiting for 22 years for their two lives to collide, patient the way only old debts are patient, and it had finally gotten what it wanted. Adriana was on her couch 3 days later, unemployed, eating cereal from the box and rewriting a resume she hated, when a number she didn't recognize lit up her phone. Miss Romano. Dante Moretti. The man from the boardroom. She sat up straighter than she meant to, annoyed at her own pulse for reacting. The one who told my boss to fire himself. That's a fair summary. How did you get my number? I own the company you used to work for, he said like it was nothing, though something underneath his voice suggested it was very much not nothing to him, that he'd spent more time than he'd admit getting it. I'd like you back. Not as an assistant. Head of internal operations. Full authority. Full back pay for 7 years of being underpaid for work that wasn't yours to give away for free. She was quiet long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Why? She said finally, guarded. The way a woman gets guarded when a stranger offers her exactly what she spent years wanting and never once asked for out loud. Because you were the most competent person in that building and no one there had the sense to see it, Dante said. I don't like waste. I especially don't like watching a man like Damian Kingston mistake someone else's brilliance for his own and never once get corrected for it. And what do you get out of it? Watching you make Damian Kingston's life difficult, he said. Something tells me you'll enjoy that far more than you'll admit to me on this call. Despite herself, she smiled at the phone like it could see her, and hated that she was glad it couldn't. Monday, she said. And I don't work for men who think ownership means control. Understood, Dante said, and hung up, smiling in a way Enzo, watching from across the room with mild alarm, had genuinely never seen on his employer's face before. The audit into Kingston Global's corruption went deeper than either of them expected. 3 executives, years of siphoned funds, a culture built on the assumption that competence without a title was invisible. The work demanded long nights, and the long nights put them in the same small office for hours at a time, close enough that Adriana started noticing things she'd rather not have noticed. The way he said her name, unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be even when he clearly did. The fact that he'd learned exactly how she took her coffee within 2 weeks, when Damian had never learned it in 7 years and had, on one memorable occasion, called her Andrea in front of a client. The way Dante listened when she talked, not the polite, waiting for his turn listening she'd gotten used to from every man in this building, but actual listening, the kind that came with follow-up questions 3 days later about things she'd mentioned once in passing and assumed he'd forgotten. You're staring, Dante said one night, not looking up from the page. I'm reading over your shoulder. You're staring. He looked up this time and the office suddenly felt smaller than it had a minute ago. It's fine. I like it. You're staring, Dante said one night, not looking up from the page. I'm reading over your shoulder. You're staring. He looked up this time and the office suddenly felt smaller than it had a minute ago. It's fine. I like it. I wasn't staring at you, she said too fast, the way lies always come out too fast. No. I was staring at the folder behind your head. The folder is very handsome, Dante agreed gravely. I understand the appeal. It has excellent bone structure for a folder. She threw a pen at him. He caught it without looking, which was, infuriatingly, the single most attractive thing he'd done all week, and she hated that she'd counted, hated more that she planned to keep counting. That became its own kind of ritual over the following 2 weeks. The late nights, the small provocations, the careful distance they both kept because neither of them trusted themselves to close it. He started ordering her dinner without asking, always exactly what she would have chosen, and when she asked how he kept guessing right, he said simply, I'm not guessing, and refused to elaborate further, which annoyed her for exactly as long as it took her to admit she didn't actually want him to stop. One night, reviewing Shell Company documents until well past 11, she fell asleep sitting up, her head tipping slowly toward his shoulder before she caught herself and jerked upright, mortified. Sorry, she said. Long week. Don't apologize, Dante said, and there was something unguarded in his voice that surprised them both. I didn't move. I noticed. I was hoping you would. The air between them went taut in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork. Adriana looked at him. Really looked, the way she usually refused to let herself, and found him already looking back, patient, unhurried, the way he looked at everything he'd already decided he wanted and was simply waiting for the right moment to reach for. Dante. I know, he said quietly. Not yet. I can wait. I've waited for things I wanted far less than this. She didn't know what to do with a man who said things like that and meant them, so she went back to the documents, and neither of them mentioned it again, though the air in that office never quite went back to what it had been before. Then, near midnight 2 nights later, a storm broke over the city, rain slamming the windows hard enough to rattle the glass, and the power in the building flickered once, twice, then held on emergency lighting, dim and amber, throwing everything in the office into something softer than fluorescent honesty usually allowed. We should stop for the night, Dante said, though he didn't move to leave. We should, Adriana agreed and didn't move either. The rain kept going. Neither of them reached for their coats. Can I ask you something? Dante said, quieter now, the practiced calm of a man who negotiated for a living slipping somewhere it usually didn't. Why did you never leave? 7 years taking the credit and never getting it. Most people would have walked years ago. Adriana was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. My mother got sick when I was in my 20s, she said. The job paid for things a smaller job wouldn't have. I told myself I was staying for her. Some years that was even true. Other years I think I stayed because I was scared that if I left, I'd have to admit how much of myself I'd already given away for nothing. She looked up. What's your excuse for staying in a family that stripped you of everything the second you stopped being useful to them? Blood, Dante said. It's a stupid reason to stay anywhere. I know that better than anyone. I stayed anyway because some part of me kept hoping that if I was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough, someone in that family would finally look at me the way I wanted to be looked at instead of the way I was useful to be looked at. He paused. You're the first person who's ever looked at me like that without me having to earn it first. The amber light sat between them, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that wasn't dangerously close to something neither of them was ready to name out loud. You should go home, Dante said finally, his voice lower than he meant it to be. I should, Adriana said and still didn't move. It was Dante who broke first, not with a kiss, though every part of the room seemed to be waiting for one, but by reaching across the desk and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, slow, deliberate, the single gentlest thing either of them had done to the other since the day they'd met. His hand lingered a half-second longer than the gesture required, and neither of them pretended not to notice. Go home, Adriana, he said softly. Before I do something we'd both have very good reasons to regret and absolutely no interest in actually regretting. She left. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. 2 weeks into the audit, Adriana found something that didn't fit. An offshore account, buried 3 layers deep in Kingston Global's books, receiving quarterly payments that traced, after 4 days of careful digging, not to a vendor or a shell contract, but to a private account belonging to Marco Rinaldi, Dante's cousin. She sat with it for a full day before she brought it to him, checking and rechecking the trail because some part of her already understood how much it would cost him to hear it. She brought it to Dante's office at 11 at night, her hands not entirely steady. Your cousin's been paid by Damien Kingston for over a year, she said, sliding the printout across the desk. Before you ever set foot in that boardroom. Dante went very still. The particular stillness she'd learned meant he was more dangerous than when he was angry. A stillness that reminded her for the first time exactly what kind of family he came from. Damien knew you were coming for the company, Adriana said slowly, working it out as she said it, watching his face for permission to keep going and finding none, and continuing anyway because he needed to hear it whole. Marco fed him information, your investment plans, your holding companies, probably even how your family council vote would go before it happened. That's why Damien was so reckless in that boardroom. He thought he had backup. He thought your own family was already working against you before you'd even started. Marco, Dante said quietly, sold me out to a man he'd never met, for money that means nothing to a family that already had everything, because he'd rather see me lose than watch me win something on my own. There's more, Adriana said, and this was the part her voice caught on. The payment started 14 months ago. Before the family council vote. Before any of this. Marco didn't just take advantage of your fall from power. Building usually emptied and found Dante exactly where she somehow knew he'd be. In her office, not his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, a stack of unrelated paperwork in front of him that she suspected correctly he hadn't actually read a single word of in 4 days. He hadn't gone home before dark once since she'd left. Enzo had mentioned it to her, unprompted, with the particular concern of a man watching someone he worked for slowly come apart in a very quiet, very controlled way. I'm not angry at you anymore, she said from the doorway. I was never really angry at you, not underneath everything else. I was angry at 22 years of not knowing my own story, and you happened to be standing closest when it finally caught up to me. Dante stood slowly, giving her every chance to stop him, and when she didn't, he crossed the room and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head to look at him. I should have told you the second I knew, he said. Not the version where I'd figured out how to make it hurt less. Just the truth the moment I had it, even if it was messy and half-formed and I didn't have the right words yet. You should have, she agreed. Tell me something now instead. Something true right now, no version of it filtered for what you think I can handle. I love you, Dante said, no hesitation this time. I loved you before I knew your father's name meant anything to mine. I'd love you if it meant nothing at all. If there were no file, no debt, no 22 years of my family quietly trying to make right what it could never fully repay. The debt doesn't change what I feel. It just means fate had a 2-decade head start on me, and I spent it not knowing you existed while some part of my family already owed you everything. That's a lot of pressure to put on one coincidence, Adriana said, but her voice had gone soft around the edges. It's not a coincidence, Dante said. I've stopped believing it's a coincidence. I think some debts don't stay buried. I think they wait until the two people who need each other most finally walk into the same hallway. Adriana closed the last of the distance herself this time, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the stormlit almost moment from weeks before. It was slower than that, more certain, the kind of kiss that didn't need the rain or the dark to excuse it, because neither of them needed an excuse anymore. It was the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like the end of a very long, very patient wait neither of them had known they were in until it was finally over. The months that followed rewired Kingston Global from the inside. The executives siphoning company funds were removed without a single headline touching the stock price. Damien resigned within the quarter, unable to stomach reporting to the woman he'd once fired in front of a room that now, quietly, respected her more than they ever had him. He took a modest severance and vanished from the industry entirely, the way men do when they mistake other people's patience for permission and finally run out of both. Marco Rinaldi's name never came up again in family conversation, and nobody in that family ever asked why, which was in its own way the loudest answer any of them needed. Adriana became chief operating officer within the year, the youngest in the company's history, and Vincent Moretti, without ever calling it what it was, began treating her the way a man treats a debt he's finally been allowed to pay openly instead of in secret. He came to dinner. He asked about her mother by name and listened to the answer. He told her once quietly over coffee neither of them finished, that her father had been the only man in that warehouse who hadn't hesitated, and that he'd spent 22 years trying to become a person worth that kind of choice. He never once mentioned the exact details of that night again, and neither did she, because some kindnesses are better carried in silence between the people who understand them, and some griefs are better honored than explained. Nearly a year to the day after Damien's voice had cracked across that boardroom table, Adriana and Dante sat together in her office. A photo of her mother on the shelf, a small plant on the windowsill that had somehow survived her travel schedule, a framed article about the company's remarkable turnaround, that never printed her name, though everyone who mattered knew exactly whose work it described, and one photograph, new, small, tucked into the corner of the frame where nobody but the two of them ever really looked. Her father, laughing, standing beside a much younger Vincent Moretti outside a warehouse that no longer existed. Marco called today, Dante said, signing off on a folder without looking up. Adriana's pen stopped moving. Which Marco? Dante glanced up and something dry and knowing passed behind his eyes. Fair question. Yours. Wants to have coffee with your mother sometime. Says he thinks she'd like to hear stories about her husband from someone who actually knew him. Someone who worked beside him instead of just paying for the silence afterward. Adriana's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. That's good, she said quietly. I'm glad. It is good, Dante agreed, closing the folder, his voice as calm and unhurried as it had been the very first day he'd walked into that boardroom uninvited, a lifetime and 22 years ago. Some debts get to end kindly. Not all of them do. And the other one, Adriana said. The one that didn't end kindly. Handled, Dante said simply, in the same tone he'd used the very first time she'd asked him that question months ago, before she understood everything that particular word had ever meant when he said it. He reached across the desk the way he had that stormy night and tucked the same loose strand of hair behind her ear, slower this time, unhurried, a gesture that had stopped needing an excuse a long time ago. Everything's fine now, Adriana. It always is, she said, smiling, and went back to her work because she'd stopped needing, a long time ago now, to ask exactly what kind of fine he meant. and had decided finally, watching him settle back into the chair across from her like a man who had, after 32 years of searching, finally found the one room he never wanted to leave that she didn't need to know. Some things were better left exactly where they belonged. Handled, quiet, and entirely, permanently his to carry. If that ending hit you the way I think it did, subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what plot twist got you the most. The cousin or the file. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. We'll see you there.